an academic exercise for me. It's a pleasure for me. He's an artist I've personally known for many years and have admired for even longer. And when there was a very important show of Rafi's work organized at El Museo del Barrio in New York, beginning June of 2010, a wonderful comprehensive show that didn't show everything because he is such an amazingly productive and prolific artist that there could be no show that would look at everything that he's ever done, but I became much more aware of all the interstices, that is to say, the big things and the small things and his ideas and his productivity, and he is, if anything, a Renaissance artist, and I mean that in the broadest possible sense. He is somebody who has passed through an immense number of stages in his formation and is constantly working on many things at the same time and on a variety of media. The number of things that he makes art from, everything from corrugated tin to traditional wood and canvas, or things that he finds in nature, such as calabashes, and I'll talk to you a little bit about the importance of the calabash for him as a Caribbean artist in a few minutes, or whether it be found objects that he picks up on the street. All of this is fodder for his immense imagination. And he belongs to many places. He belongs out here in Long Island, on the east end of Long Island. He's lived in Greenport for almost 20 years. I think he's attracted to the idea of living on an island because he was born on an island. He was born in Puerto Rico, and he has talked to me on many occasions of the immense importance for him of being in an island culture, specifically the Caribbean culture. And he has lived in several places in the Caribbean, and we look at some of his highly expressive paintings that he did when he was living in the Dominican Republic between 1983 and 1995. But I wanted to begin in front of this, which is, for those of you who know his work, a very well-known painting. For those of you who don't, I think it's one of his most fascinating pictures because it is very much a homage to one of the figures that is of immense importance to him. I'm an art historian, and Rafael Ferrer is someone who knows the history of art inside and out. And as we look at and make comments on some of these collages, paintings, sculptures, drawings, and mixed media pieces, he very often makes references to the whole history of art. Obviously, modern masters from Munch to Mondrian to Picasso are very much present, but also many Caribbean artists. And I wanted to start here with a painting that he did of the great Cuban modernist Wilfredo Lam. Now, let's just talk a little bit about Rafi's training and about his early years, because much of what he did when he was a very, very young artist is not represented in the exhibition. Much of what made his name in the New York art world in the 1960s and in the early 1970s was ephemeral art, art that we could conventionally call conceptual art, even though he was not crazy about using that term. He's an artist who never likes to be pigeonholed, and if someone says to him, oh, you were conceptualist in the 60s or you were neo-expressionist in the 80s, he gets a bit riled up, and he's not a person to hold his emotions in. So he will yell and scream and say no and try to clarify. But I did have many conversations with him because I'm particularly interested in his, as I'm interested in many artists' work and how they started. So just to give you a few biographical facts, he was born in 1933, and that's interesting because it was exactly 100 years after, almost to the day, that one of his art historical heroes, the very eminent Puerto Rican painter whose name is Francisco Oller, and Francisco Oller is an artist associated with his contemporaries in Paris, like Pissarro and Courbet and Cézanne, all of whom he knew very well, spending many, many years in Paris. And Rafael Ferrer is very much under the spell of Francisco Oller, and he was born 100 years later. So he was born in Puerto Rico and spent his very early years between the U.S. and the island. And of course, like many Puerto Ricans who are of two places, they are of their culture, they are of the mainland. Puerto Rico is often referred to as the last colony in the world, and it is still a colony of the United States after having been liberated from Spain, where it had become since the 1530s a colony of Spain. Then the Spanish-American War happened in 1893. country, something that he refers to in one of his drawings we'll look at in a little while, and then it passed into being a colony of the United States. But it is very much a country and a culture unto itself, and he is very much an artist who identifies himself as a Puerto Rican and as a person of the Caribbean. But he went to school in the United States. He went to a military academy in Virginia, the Staunton Military Academy, for several years. He studied at the University at Syracuse for several years and at the University of Puerto Rico. So he went for 2 years to Syracuse and then decided to go back to San Juan. And this was a very critical decision for him, because that return and his engagement with artists who had come to Puerto Rico during the years of the Spanish Civil War from 1936 to 1939, artists, poets, filmmakers, writers, Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the Dominican Republic had become in the 30s and 40s great centers of intellectual efflorescence, great centers of surrealist activity. André Breton, the so-called high priest of surrealism, spent considerable amount of time in Havana and in Santo Domingo, had been to San Juan, and so surrealism was in the air. And this was something that he became tremendously interested in the 1950s when he went back to Puerto Rico. So we had long conversations about this. One of his teachers was a teacher at the University of Puerto Rico called Eugenio Granel. And Granel had come to Puerto Rico from Spain, having been forced out of Spain because of his political affiliation during the time of the Franco dictatorship, and he became a famous teacher at the University of San Juan. He later became a famous teacher at Brooklyn College, where he ultimately ended up. But he was the person who introduced Rafael Ferrer to surrealism, and to all of the idea of dreamlike existence and trying to evoke one's inner life on paper, in prints, on canvas. And he not only showed him his work, and actually some of Rafi's very earliest work are surrealist drawings and paintings, very much in the manner of artists like André Masson and Joan Miro, and all of these people that his teacher Granel had explained to him. And as a matter of fact, a lot of his early work, which he has only in his house, it's very rarely been shown. It was shown, incidentally, at the El Museo exhibition. And I want to open a little parenthesis and say that when Roberta Smith of the New York Times wrote her glowing review of that show, which was curated by Deborah Cullen, who is the chief curator at El Museo, Roberta Smith said, "This exhibition is criminally overdue, for Rafael Ferrer is such a major figure within the history of so many movements in contemporary art, and has not been recognized as such for so long, that this show, and I would say by extension, the Guildhall show and the exhibition that's currently being prepared, another Rafael Ferrer show for a museum in Pennsylvania, is part of a re-encounter with this artist in his later phases of his career. He's now 78, but 78 is the new 48, so he's not at least nowhere near finishing his career. But I think that with the globalization of the art world, with the realization of the fact that we have to break down these boundaries, and instead of looking at artists as English artists or American artists or Latin American artists, that we look at them as part of a larger flow of the contemporary art world. And so this is something, very fortunately, that this exhibition, so beautifully curated by Esperanza de Leon and very beautifully installed by Christina and her staff here at the museum. This is part of a project that is going on, and our re-encountering with Rafael Ferrer as part of this larger flow of contemporary art. All right, so why am I standing in front of this painting about Wilfredo Lam? One of the people that his teacher at the University of Puerto Rico said, you have got to go and meet, and one of the people that is going to be very important for you is the Cuban-born artist who had lived in Paris, who had spent very long periods of time in Italy, in the United States, peripatetic artist. This is Wilfredo Lam. Wilfredo Lam, who from the 1920s until 1938 was in Spain, 1938 and 9 was in Paris, working intimately with Picasso, then re-encountered Cuba and the other surrealists that who had already gone to Havana, where he remained during the Second World War years, and then ultimately he returned to Europe. And that is where, in Paris, where Rafi went at the urging of his friends and his teachers, and he made friends with Rafael Lam. So Lam had been a part of the Surrealist movement. Lam had been part of what the museum director and art historian Lowry Sims, who wrote the major monograph on Rafael Lam, describes him as an integral member of the international avant-garde. And so Lam embodies so many things art historically, and also embodies many racial and ethnic and historical characteristics, as he was an artist born in Cuba of a Chinese father and an African Spanish mother. And so he was also interested in the large number of cultural references that ethnic heritage implied. He was also interested in Afro-Cuban religions, and translated all of this into idioms that may be related to both Cubism and Surrealism. So Rafael Ferrer was fascinated by him, and they became fast friends. And at one point, Lam gave him a drawing to this very young 20-some-year-old artist, and inscribed it, "To my friend and fellow artist, Rafael Ferrer, from Wilfredo Lam," a drawing that he very much treasures and has in his house in Greenport. So later on in the 80s, Ferrer, who by this time is doing large series of paintings, very much in the neo-expressionist vein. Again, he'd probably say I was not a neo-expressionist, but think, and we'll see a number of other such paintings, but I thought it was a good place to start here. Think of neo-expressionism in the hands of people like Francesco Clemente or Eric Fischl, to name just a few, and we can fit Rafael Ferrer's work into that vein. We can fit his work into the vein of assemblage, of traditional portraiture. Much of his work has to do with portraits of friends and family. But again, referring to this, it's a very important picture because it's a homage to someone he very much admired. It is a portrait of Lam standing in front of his own great masterpiece, the painting called The Jungle, which is in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art, a painting from 1944, which is in the Moderns collection. It now has a principal and very well situated place in the museum's collection, but for many, many years it was next to the coat room at the entrance to the museum. There was actually a quite well-known article written a number of years ago that was called "Wilfredo Lam, Please Stand by the Coat Room," criticizing the marginalization of this great international artist, but because he was a Cuban artist, somebody from the tropics, he was put over by the coat room. So this is a revindication, in a sense, not only Lam, but also of this great masterpiece, and a homage to a person that he admired. Here's Rafael Ferrer himself, and I love this combination of the work because he is almost looking, as he looks out to the side, he seems to be very stern. He's not stern at all. He's a great talker, a great raconteur, and a charming person, but he is someone who's a great self-examiner. He always talks about his thoughts, and he's one of the aspects that's not in this exhibition, but if anyone goes to see him in his own collection, he's a great writer, and he does dozens and dozens of artist books, and these books are filled with his writings, his opinions, and filled with amazing drawings. And he is, among other things, a great political cartoonist and satirist. And I just was speaking to somebody earlier, and I said, some of these drawings, and we'll see a few of them down this way in the exhibition, are sort of halfway between R. Crumb and Roz Chast, but with much more bite to them. And so he is a person who is a great satirist. But many of his friends and colleagues are the subjects of his portraits. We see a few of them here, and we also see in between one of his corrugated tin pieces. Now, when I did my many conversations with him in order to do this essay for the catalog of El Museo show, we talked mainly about the Caribbean, because the Caribbean is one of my great passions. I'm very interested in places like Haiti, the Dominican Republic, Republic and Puerto Rico, and have spent a great deal of time in those places. And he connects very much with them. He doesn't necessarily want to be thought of only as a Puerto Rican artist or only as a Caribbean artist, but the Caribbean, this aqueous universe, as I sometimes think of it, this place which is a crossroads of the world, literally a place that since the convergence of cultures after 1492, it was the place of first landing of Columbus, it was the place of importation of African slaves, it was the place of migration of people from India and people from China and Japan. It was a place with links, obviously, to Europe. It was a place of multiple ethnicities and multiple colonial experiences, from the Danish to the French to the English, of course, the Spanish, and ultimately the American and the Dutch. And so this very broad place is something that, a thing, an entity, that Ferrer thinks about a great deal. And one of the forms of art, one of the materials that's often used in popular arts in the Caribbean is tin. You all know those tin drums that in Trinidad and Tobago create that very distinctive music. It is those same drums that in Haiti, artists in the small town of Poilé-Bouquet near Port-au-Prince have created an immense body of sculpture out of this found material of tin, and many of the sculptures that are painted in what would seem to be a very almost faux naive way are manifestations of another type of homage to a specific place and a specific form of making art. And I didn't want to leave this area of the exhibition without referring to this piece, which is entitled L'Homme, and of course it refers directly to the painting of L'Homme, and it is made up of a virtually surreal-looking series of organically placed tentacle-like arms on which are affixed 3 calabashes. Now, the calabash is a gourd, of course, and it is one of the most characteristic fruits of the Caribbean. And as a matter of fact, there's a well-known magazine about Caribbean literature and culture called Calabash, and it has been used over and over again in the iconography, whether it be visual or literary, of the Caribbean. And he very deliberately uses the calabash in a piece that is making reference to L'Homme himself, because each of the calabashes is painted and incised with an L at the top, with L-A-M, L'Homme, and with the types of figures such as this mask, which is found in his work of this is a painting within a painting, or a homage to L'Homme's painting The Jungle. And this type of figure, this type of head, refers to L'Homme's interest, Ferrer's interest in African sculpture. And of course, it also refers furtherly, if that's a word, to Picasso's interest in African culture and African visual culture. And interestingly enough, in the conversations between L'Homme and Picasso, there was a lot of discussion about Africa and African art and African masks. Picasso was discovering it at the Museum of Mankind, the anthropological museum in Paris. But L'Homme himself was an Afro-Caribbean man, and was very much aware of these traditions of masking and these traditions of Afro-Caribbean religions. He was very interested in Santeria, and much of this mask-like aura that he creates in his paintings have to do with his very direct knowledge of, via his godmother, a woman who raised him, who was a Santeria priestess. So here we have him referring to these same masks that Picasso and L'Homme were interested in, but he himself is a man from the Caribbean, so he is approaching these subjects from an insider's point of view. So there's all this ethnic complexity in this work by Rafael Ferrer, but at the same time he's creating these sculptures that in their forms hark back to artists like Jean Arp and Miro and many others, Masson for example, who use these quasi-humanoid tentacles in their paintings or in their sculptures. So why don't we continue on, if you wouldn't mind If you want to sit there, you can listen to me, but it's much more interesting to look. So I'm obviously not going to talk about every single work in the exhibition. I very happily was able to come here before this talk and sort of scope out the things that I most wanted to discuss. And one of them is this painting here. So as I mentioned, there was a long period of Ferrer's career, 1983 to mid-90s, when he was living in the Dominican Republic. And this, I think, was a very, very important time for him. And he identified with the landscape, of course, was very much like Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic, on the large island of Hispaniola, which it shares with Haiti, of course, is a place that he found very sympathetic, and among other things, sympathetic because of music. And I wanted to talk a little bit about this painting, which is called Juancito y Esteban, two friends of his. Most of the pictures that he did in the Dominican Republic were of friends, of the places that he knew, of his neighbors, of his neighborhood. He did not have a grand house. He did not have a luxurious dwelling place. He was living next to people of very modest means. And he often, very interestingly, in these very expressionist paintings done, as you'll see, with very lively strokes of the paint and very vivid colors, he is evoking Caribbean light, but he's not necessarily evoking a Caribbean place in a stereotypical way or in a cliched way. Very often, and this is the challenge for someone like myself who's very seriously academically interested in the Caribbean, you often think of the Caribbean as a place where you go on a carnival cruise and you drink lots of rum and you have a good time and it's all lovely and fun and you go to the beach and whatever else happens, happens. The Caribbean is also a place where people live their everyday life. It's also a place, in many cases, of economic privation, and he is not someone to perpetuate stereotypes, and we'll see in a moment some of the images in which he shows maybe a darker side of the Caribbean. But you cannot get away, no matter where you go, whether you're in the Bahamas or whether you're in Aruba or Curacao or St. Lucia or anywhere, Puerto Rico, Cuba, you cannot get away from music. Lively music, of course, every culture, every island has its different forms of music, but music forms a great backdrop to everyone's sensibility who lives in and visits and has any knowledge of the Caribbean. Now, it is natural that Rafael Ferrer would create many works of art that have to do with music because he was a musician. As a matter of fact, he started his life thinking that that would be his life's work. He came from a fairly well-to-do family in Puerto Rico. As many of you know, his uncle was the film actor Jose Ferrer, who was also, when Rafi was a teenager, married to Rosemary Clooney. So there's that connection, which a lot of people focus on. But when he was living in the US, and then when he went back to Puerto Rico, he started his career, and he had a very distinguished career as a percussionist. And music is constantly a part of, either directly or indirectly, a part of his work. And so here he's showing three of his friends, one of them actually playing these drums, and it is really, in a sense, almost a self-portrait, because so much, not that any of these people are self-portraits, and we did see a self-portrait a moment ago, but his intense love of and interest in music is very much a part of his work. So several of these sculptures, which always fascinate me because they are so, in a sense, they are very vegetal. They seem to creep and crawl, and the arms or the swerving and curling tentacles, and sometimes these vegetal-like objects seem to almost grow out of a jungle-like setting. And in a sense, that way too, they seem to be connected with the earth and connected with an earth of great fecundity, an earth in which plants grow up without your caring for them at all, as they do in a tropical surrounding. Again, using the calabash and again reinforcing that sense of place. These two objects right here, an object which is part of a series in this painting, I'll just talk about the painting for a few moments. It is a painting, again, done, in this case, in early the early 90s, 1991, that was done in the Dominican Republic, and it shows exactly the sort of places that the tourists don't see. You go to the X resort and the golf resort and spas and so on, but very often you don't get out into the countryside, whether it be in the Dominican Republic or Puerto Rico or any of the other islands that people go to for their vacations, and see how people live who are not connected with the tourist trade. And here is a very typical example of this work done in a very, very active way. And I think that were someone to do, I think it's a great idea for an exhibition, a show of international neo-expressionism, which is a phenomenon that came about beginning around 1980, when the Royal Academy in London did an exhibition, a now quite famous exhibition called A New Spirit of Painting, in which they showed for the first time together artists who were rejecting the minimalism and the conceptualism of the 70s and going back to color and going back to very enthusiastic and very vibrant forms of painting. And I mentioned people like Schnabel and Eric Fischl and the Italian Sandro Chia and Zokuki, etc., all part of this international George Baselitz from Germany, just to name a few, Susan Rothenberg from the United States, many others. If you were to do a major retrospective of that form of art, certainly these paintings from the 80s, early 90s by Ferrer would fit perfectly well into that category, from their gestural quality and from their sense of very vibrant color. But I'm also very interested in this because it does not show this sense of the luxury and the beauty of the Caribbean, but rather a place where people live in very simple, very poor houses of corrugated tin, which in the interior may have one window or two. These children are obviously very thin. They're very undernourished children. They are living among, not in misery, because this is not a social realist art, although he's certainly very much aware of the whole tradition of Mexican muralism and social realism, and actually I'd never even thought until this moment of Ferrer and Mexican muralism, but the Mexican muralists had such a huge impact throughout the Americas, not only in their day, not only in the 20s and 30s, but artists continued to feel that for decades after that. And the Mexican muralists like Rivera, and those of you who go into Manhattan should go to the Museum of Modern Art that just very recently opened up a very important show of Diego Rivera and muralism. And I think that the idea of monumental figures, the idea of socially concerned art that people like Diego Rivera were starting to do in 1921, 1922, the first years of the Mexican mural Renaissance, as it's called, certainly must have had an impact on Rothy's work. And I will have to make a point to ask him about that. He was supposed to be here today, as a matter of fact, but he had to be in Puerto Rico because a very interesting thing that has to do with the next thing I want to talk about. He had done a series of sculptures which was installed in a public spot in Puerto Rico, supposedly forever, and a recent political appointee decided that they should be put away. They're taken down, and he went down to fight the good fight in Puerto Rico, as he told me in an email the other day. So when I see him the next time, I will ask him. Now, this is a much more recent work, a 2003-4 work, which is part of the series. It's a maquette, and it is a very interesting piece that is called Marcel Duchamp's Lighthouse, or El Faro de Duchamp. Now, Duchamp, of course, the artist who, since the 1940s, when he was really recognized as the founder of all things experimental in modern art, has been something of the godfather for artists who are interested in breaking boundaries in any possible way. And what Ferrer does in this piece is to create a fantasy on Marcel Duchamp, one of his most famous works, and that work is his bicycle wheel, because of course Duchamp is well known for his found images, or his found objects rather, objets trouvés. And the most famous or infamous thing is 1917 piece, which he signed in one of his fictitious names, R. Mutt, which was a urinal that he had bought at a hardware store and installed in an art exhibition. And the bottle rack and the bicycle wheel were among the found objects that he exhibited. And what I think that Rafi does here is to pay homage to Duchamp, but to take it many steps further. So he has this reference to the bicycle wheel, but he also has it as a movable public monument, and the bicycle wheel has sprouted wings, and he has this enigmatic carving, which with the sculpture would be inside, which says nada, nothing. So the idea of beingness and nothingness, to quote Jean-Paul Sartre, is present in this piece too. So he's always questioning the validity of what he does and what other people do, things that are real, things that are not real, and he's always critiquing. Now the idea of critique comes in, and this is probably not a good idea to talk about in a very fairly small, a rather large group like ours, because it's a really small work. But I want you, it's an immensely interesting work, and I would like you to pay attention to it. It's a fairly recent work in 2007, which is called PM. PM doesn't mean the afternoon, it means P. Mondrian. And Mondrian is another one of these artists to whom he pays great homage. But this is such a complex work, I just want to say a few words about it. First of all, Mondrian appears here as a direct homage to Mondrian in the upper right-hand corner with his distinctive big glasses and fairly large nose. Of course, Mondrian's most characteristic and famous work of his later phase are his very abstemious grid paintings in primary colors, which grew out of his 1930s engagement with the movement to style that he developed in Paris and with many of his colleagues, Dutch and international. And these paintings these sorts of paintings are referred to in these colors yellow, blue, and red here. And so the whole thing becomes a homage to Piet Mondrian, but at the same time, it is very much more. It is also a collage, so that's very anti-Mondrian. Mondrian would be absolutely horrified if somebody would use his pure art and collage over it. So it's accepting and rejecting that, but at the same time he uses this format for his many instances of social commentary and social protest. Remember I talked about the Spanish Civil War and the Spanish-American War and various other atrocities. Here he lists a whole category of wars. And many of them, not all, but many of them have to do with the participation of the United States in some sort of nefarious political activity. First of all, here, Indian Wars, Civil War, the United States, and the Indian Wars against the North American indigenous population. Spanish-American War, Korea, Dominican Republic. There was a large-scale American invasion present in the Dominican Republic in the 20s and 30s for many years. Grenada, the American invasion of Grenada. Panama, the American activity in Panama at the time of General Noriega. Persian Gulf, Afghanistan, Iraq. And at the bottom, various other inscriptions: enduring freedom, waterboarding, of course referring to torture methods in Iraq. So what is at the outset, when we approach this, something of a commentary on the history of art becomes a commentary on the history of political malfeasance. So he's constantly blending and mixing these ideas in his work. So I think that's an enormously interesting comment on the many things he's thinking about at the same time. So I want to talk about these two pieces for a moment as well. Oh, please, yes.
On the Nada piece.
Yes.
I'm interested in on the back row photo.
Oh, so everything and nothing.
So, yes.
So the opposites, polarities, binaries.
Anyway,
Yes. I also wondered if it referred in an oblique way to André Breton's novel Nadja, which is a surrealist novel, N-A-J-D-A. I don't think so, but thank you for pointing that out. And please, I can blab on for hours, and please interrupt me. I won't be the least bit, I'll be very happy if you do. So, as an art historian, to talk about Ferrer's work is always endlessly fascinating, because you never know what reference he's going to come up with in terms of his engagement with the past, with the art historical past both American and European. And this painting, for those of you who know your history of Norwegian symbolism and the great figure of Edvard Munch, Munch did a very famous self-portrait in which he himself shows, almost in a similar way to that very famous Munch called The Scream, he shows himself set against a rather desolate landscape. And here, this is an appropriation and 1989 was very much a time when appropriation art becomes quite popular. There's currently, for instance, a show at the Whitney Museum in Manhattan of Sherry Levine, and Sherry Levine was one of the most important figures in appropriation art in the 70s and 80s. I mean, not that that has anything to do with Rafael Ferrer's work, but the idea of appropriating elements and appropriating approaches is something that he does all the time. I find it fascinating that he is, and remember this comment because it will have to do with something I want to say about the other side of the room, that he is putting himself in the guise of this quintessentially northern symbolist artist who is Edvard Munch, and he is a quintessentially Caribbean artist, usually characterized by sun and bright color. And here he turns himself into a depressive Nordic, and he has his hand on his head, or his headrest in his hand in this very introverted or introspective way, as a Munch-like desolate northern landscape appears in the background. Now, right next to it, and the installation, as I mentioned earlier, I think is so beautiful because it awakes in us, when we look at it, all these conversations. We're thinking about, what does this mean in relation to that? And this painting or this sculpture is talking to another one across the gallery. Doing an installation for an exhibition is sometimes the hardest part. You can work for years on getting the work and contacting the lenders and writing catalog essays, and then you have all the work in the gallery, and then you think, oh my God, now what am I going to do? Of course, installations are usually the result of months and months, if not years, of planning with little maquettes and working things out, but it's always the moment of truth when things arrive, and you have to make these conversations happen. And I think this is a very interesting and very well thought out series of conversations that are established in this room. But here we have another of these series, as we have behind you, which is behind the curator. This is Esperanza, the curator, and we all thank you very much. Congratulations. With her product, even much more important than art, her work of art. This is a maquette also for a sculpture called Morandi's Cup. And of course it's referring to Giorgio Morandi, the great Italian artist who obsessively painted throughout his career the same set of bottles and cups in small, almost monochromatic paintings. Again, rather the antithesis of the sort of thing we think about as interest, being of interest to Rafael Ferrer. And here is one called The Picture, Giacometti's Picture. And again, the homage to the history of art here, and it's actually a very interesting example because it has some comments written by the artist in his own hand on the front and on the back. All right, I'm going to turn around and want to make a comment or two on two pieces on this wall. One of them is this object, a 1981 object called Winds, or Brisas, or not winds, but I guess that's the right term for it. It is one of his assemblages, these found objects. A drum, bits of wire, which he has, in an almost tortured sense, tied up with twine and thin wire, little bits of, might be a bracelet that somebody might have worn, all covered with these overall patterns. And of course, what does the overall pattern remind all of you from the East End of Long Long Island of none other than one of the great sons of the history of art, developed in Springs, and of course Jackson Pollock. So I think he's looking at Jackson Pollock, but he's also making reference to things like fans and things like breezes. Brisas actually is a better translation of the term brisa in Spanish, and it also reminds us of windows and openings and Caribbean breezes. And so again, it's nature, it's found objects, and it's art. That is what we are seeing here. So a few things in this. I have no idea what time it is. We have a little bit of time. Another of these works in which he is evincing a sense of social consciousness. Now, you might think that this is just a lovely scene on a beach, and it's a 1993 picture called Dulzura. The word itself means sweetness. But it actually is quite, in a way, the opposite of sweetness, because what it shows is a pleasant scene, in a way, of a beach in this case in the Dominican Republic, and on this beach is a woman of very dark complexion, and she is selling things. She is selling fruits. She has on her head a large metal bowl of fruit filled with bananas and guavas and pineapples, and she holds this. She holds a coconut in her hand, and she has what must be two very heavy bags of other fruit. So, for one thing, she cannot be comfortable. She has this heavy thing on her head. She has this very weighty coconut in her hand. She has these bags that are attached to her arm, and she carries in her other hand. On one hand, this is very interesting because I am thinking of a Colombian artist called Ana Mercedes Hoyos, who does many paintings of women on the beach at Cartagena in Colombia. So, in a sense, there's some sort of crossing between two Caribbean artists. But what this is really about is exile. This is a Haitian woman who has been, for any number of reasons, all to do with economic privations, been forced to go to a resort town. We don't know what town this is, but any number of resort towns, Casa de Campo, or all these resorts that you can buy package tours and go and spend 10 days there in luxury. But she's working on the beach with this heavy bowl of fruit and probably selling this for pennies. And she also is not well received because there has been traditional enmity and, if not animosity, between Haiti and the Dominican Republics. At times, this has been transformed into some sort of mutual cooperation, particularly during the time of the devastating earthquake that took place in Haiti now almost 2 years ago, where there was a great deal of cooperation on the part of Dominican and Haitians, but things have become since then much more tense. And this tense relationship between the two countries that share this island has always been extremely difficult. And I think that despite the fact that unless you know something about these historical phenomena, you wouldn't realize the undertow or the underlying sense of tension and anxiety that pervades this painting. So that duality, that binary, that is in Rafa's work so often is very beautifully here, and I think in a very subtle way. All right, let's look at these very interesting kayaks for a few moments. I didn't say too much about his early work, and I just wanted to make a point right now about what made him very famous in 1969, 1970. And it has nothing to do with what we see in these galleries. He was one of the most distinguished artists who took part in conceptual artwork projects in the late 60s and early 70s. He was, for example, the only Caribbean artist who was invited to take part in an exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in 1970 called Information. which was a sort of manifesto exhibition of conceptualism that was organized by the curator Kiniston McShine. He took part in a Whitney biennial around the same time. He did a very important intervention in front of the Philadelphia Museum, in which he physically got into the fountain. If you know the Philadelphia Museum, in front of those big stairs that Rocky climbs up in that movie, there's a big fountain by, I think, Jock Lipschitz, if I'm not mistaken. And he jumped into the fountain, and with his body, he redirected the water to a different place. In Leo Castelli Warehouse Gallery, he brought 3 massive amounts of leaves and filled the gallery with leaves. And in the Museum of Modern Art, he filled, or the Whitney rather, he filled the space of the entrance with something like 3 tons of ice. Ice, cold things, hot waters of the Caribbean. He told me he's fascinated by ice. He said anyone who lives in the Caribbean has to be fascinated by ice because it's so hard to keep ice there. Ice melts. There are no big blocks of ice. And then I said to him, do you remember when, in 1954, the mayor of the city of San Juan, Puerto Rico, imported 3 tons of snow from somewhere in the United States in January, so that the children could, for at least about an hour, experience a northern U.S. winter. So then we started talking about kayaks, and he said you usually associate kayaks with places like Scandinavia or northern places, places where you get into a kayak all like the Eskimos in Canada or in Greenland, and with their covering of whaleskin jackets, and they sail out and do their fishing. And I became, he said, fascinated by kayaks. Not only that, I also wanted to make kayaks that even transgressed more than the normal idea of the incongruity of a kayak in the Caribbean. I made them, and these are only small ones, he's made immense ones, with things like corrugated tin. So if you get into a kayak that is made of tin, you're not going to last for more than a couple of seconds. So this idea about things that are real and things that are not real, things that are functional and things that are absurd. And the idea of absurdity is always present in his work, this idea of the ironic, the absurd, questioning of reality, questioning of functionality, and this is precisely what the kayak series is all about. And I think it's a perfect example of this constantly, this mind that's working in an almost obsessive way. So the last 2 things I wanted to comment on are about works that were made, at least in part, for this exhibition, which is always very exciting to see new work that an artist has done for a particular exhibition. And this is part of an ongoing, continuing series of works on these small blackboards, the sort of blackboards that children pre-computer age would have been using, maybe our parents' or grandparents' generation, with chalk in classrooms to learn to count, learn to write. And he, of course, again, subverts the nature of the utilitarian aspect of the blackboard and uses them for any possible purpose he can imagine. They might be text, and text and image is something that is constantly present in the art of Rafael Ferrer. He might look back to an old master painting. Here, the famous painting by Ingres, La Source, The Source of the River, a famous neoclassical work by Ingres. Here, Yale Club, talking about people who were on the in crowd and people who were on the out crowd. No one to infinity with impunity. I think that very often, if you read his texts out loud, it almost sounds like rap. And he does, because he is very interested in the association of text and rhythm. And so when you're standing in front of pieces, I haven't been able to comment on everything, and read them all. There's one beautiful one over here, which is a series of little mini poems. They're enigmatic, but if you read them out loud or read them to yourself, you will, I think, get something of that idea of the musicality of his rhythms. So these are ongoing series, and very much the idea of series without an end. Because when you start series of things like this, or we can finish over here by looking at the paper bag series, he doesn't say, I'm going to do 50 of this or I'm going to do 50 of that. He will do 100, a dozen, until he gets to a point of exhaustion. And he feels as if he has evoked as much both visual or emotional from what he can glean of this particular form of art. So the paper bags, he's used the cheapest possible medium usually associated with things that we buy in a CVS store. We take out the aspirin bottle and throw away the bag. And these ephemeral things are now becoming as important as canvases for the creation of, in many cases, portraits. And it's this ongoing engagement with the face as the indicator of a whole life behind that face. He can do it with self-portrait. He does it with fantasy portraits. Sometimes the so-called naive art or the art of the insane is fascinating to him, just as it was fascinating to artists such as Paul Klee, who was just completely obsessed with naive art, intuitive art, and the art of the insane, or portraits of friends, patterns, portraits of imagined people, and things from, for example, the second row down with this man who reminds us a little bit of, say, Osama bin Laden or someone like that, and it includes a little text about terrorism. So things that are current, things that are fascinating to all of us. Here, dreamlike things. Sometimes he draws like a child, and he's fascinated by this idea of the childlike, not the childishness, but the childlike, or the evocations of what children can paint. And sometimes we're so fascinated by what children do because they often create such unexpected things that are directly from their unconscious creativity. So that's another concept that I wanted to end with, this notion of making concrete or making palpable the unconscious urge to creativity. So that is what, that is perhaps one of the most important things that I see him doing, being open to things that he might not have thought about yesterday, or he might forget about tomorrow, but everything is fodder for his work, his dreams, his comments, his anger with things, his disgust with social situation, and his fascination with art of all times, from Lam to Mondrian to Ang to Leonardo da Vinci. So I could talk much more, but maybe you have a few questions to ask or comments you want to make on your own about some of these pieces. Yes?
Is he himself involved with those religions, the Santeria?
No, I think he's interested in them, but no, he's not a person of any organized religion, but certainly has read, he's a voracious reader, and knows about all these things. Probably he was most fascinated by Afro-Cuban religions or Afro-Caribbean religions because of his relationship to Lam.
Well, I know Lam himself was a believer in them, and the horse image was in reference to the idea that when you become possessed by the spirits, they ride you. So that's where the horse image came from. So,
but that is a very, I think, a quite important point. Especially actually, this is one of a whole series. There was a very interesting exhibition that he did about 2 years ago at the Marion Martin Gallery in New York of his work called Homage to Lam. And so there were lots of other of those Santeria-derived forms in there. So, but they come to him via Lam. I don't think that he discovered them on his own. Let's put it that way. Yeah.
I just think that putting them on the bags in that way, it also relates to masks, because children do put bags in at the bottom, it's always something that is.
Of course, masking, yes. Masking, and then you can take the idea of the mask to the idea of carnival, and every island culture, every Caribbean culture has its own carnival. The idea of completely transforming your personality by putting on a mask, whether it be a child at Halloween or someone in a masked ball. So that idea of hiding and reinventing is something that is very interesting in this series as well.
The other thing is the relation to Alex Katz. I just see the portraits in some of the primary colors.
Oh yes, well of course they were great friends, and Katz came to visit him.
Because I see that definitely although some of these are more masked, like it has
Yeah.
more of the exaggerated lips and things of a.
That actually was a
African.
point that I wanted to bring out, and the relationship also to pop art is the flat colors and the sort of deadpan aspect of some of these paintings, especially, the portraits that are in dialogue, let's say, with Alex Katz, who visited him with his wife Ada in Puerto Rico. Sorry, you
I was going to say also it's about the economics of the Caribbean too, you know, the fact that the artist can get its canvases from the paper bags and it's
Sure.
taking the local,
Right.
what's available to do your art and your expression, express your feelings.
Exactly, and the same way using tin, like for that sculpture, the one that I mentioned a little while ago, or the calabash, which you don't have to buy, you can just get it off a tree.
Right.
So yes, the precariousness of the economy, that's also, I think, an important point in that, looking at the bag series.
Is the misspelling purposeful? In other words,
Oh
in
yeah,
that case, it's
he's a great creator of puns.
Mhm.
And so sometimes the puns include misspellings or alternate
This is
spellings,
full of
and
them.
yes, that's definitely part of his whole
I
thing.
didn't know if it was just sort of an anti-intellectual thing also, or, you know, in
It's a
other words.
faux anti-intellectual.
Well, absolutely.
I think so. Any other comments or questions?
This is about just standing in front of this one, which is a great critique of the museum, the art economy.
Oh, he
But now they
gets
say-
started on talking about the art world, and
Yeah.
he will chew your ear off.
Yeah.
He is very articulate on the politics of the art world. And among other things, the art world, the vagaries of the art world to a certain extent have left him out of the canonical story, because a lot of the canonical story is based upon New York-based or Paris-based critics, or what you could call a Eurocentric vision of things. And very often, to be honest, artists from places like the Caribbean don't make it into the textbooks. And he's very aware of that. And this is why I was making the point of the importance of this and related exhibitions, the one in New York, the one that's going to happen next year, as a part of what's happily now happening. And Esty, you know this very well, Esty Brodsky, who's so important in as promoting art of Latin America and the Caribbean. There is a great deal to do still, but a great deal is going on. So, but he's very conscious of this, and he makes no bones about his feelings of sometimes of being marginalized, or people, artists of his generation from the Caribbean being marginalized, and a lot of the art you can see that in.
The cartooning type
Yeah.
design too, almost
Exactly.
graffiti-like.
I'm curious to know how many of you had not seen any work of Rafael Ferrer before this show? Yeah, so maybe half had not seen it. So, you know, I hope that the museum, I know that Guildhall is dedicated primarily to artists who are on the east end of Long Island, which, of course, there have been generations of brilliant artists. There are other artists I would hope would show here who are from Latino backgrounds, from Latin America, from the Caribbean, and I think this is a wonderful precedent. So I don't presume to tell the director what she should do, but I would love to come back.
We'd love to have you back.
So I think that you've started a good thing, and keep doing the good work. So thank you for letting me speak to you, and thank you for creating this beautiful exhibition.
We thank
So-
you.